in anticipation of doing this conversation, I've been reading up a lot of your books, a lot about you. I've been listening to you on various talks and podcasts, and I've come to understand before your official designation gets mentioned in your introduction, what needs to be mentioned is that you are, how would you say, a connoisseur of history, geography, almost like there is a interest in maritime specific history and geography. I know you worked in Deutsche Bank before, so you have a whole different angle of finance and economics built into it. And at this point, my assumption is, I may be wrong, correct me if I am, you work as a member of the Economic Advisory Committee to the Prime Minister of India.
Yes.
Is that a fair introduction, sir?
Yes.
Did I whip it up?
Yeah,
right?
I'm in the Prime Minister's Economic Advisory Council.
Right. How different is this life from, let's say, the life of history, geography, and finance before?
Well, it's difficult for me to separate it from the history part because that's not my primary occupation.
Right.
So I've kept doing it in my life in financial markets and now as well. So it has always been kind of at the background, but been around for a long time.
Right.
So there's never been any clean break from it. But there has been a clean break for my life in finance. And so, yes, I spent 22 years in financial markets between 1995 and 2015. Actually, 2017, if you can stretch it to. So in that time, much of it spent in Singapore, by the way. I was basically financial markets economist, global strategist for Deutsche Bank. And my job really was to look at global risks, look at big trends globally, look at what's happening in exchange rates or interest rates and stuff like that,
right.
Political risk and things like that. So that was my life. It was obviously risk analysis and opportunities kind of life.
Right.
So in some ways, it's not completely different from what I do. So there is a link. But yes, it was for a private sector. I was traveling a lot. The people I talked to mostly were large investors, corporations, and
bankers
so on.
And so
bankers
on,
and so on. But there, my job was not to try and fix whatever was the system. My job was to simply understand what it was and make a best guess about how things were panning out.
Right.
So I had no role to play in fixing the issues. I was a bystander, and my job was to try and guess how things will pan out as best as I could. Here, the job goes one step further. So since I joined the government in 2017 as Principal Economic Advisor first, where I spent 5 years, and now in Prime Minister Modi's Economic Council, my job is really to not only understand that this is an issue and try and guess it, but also attempt to do something about it.
Right.
So this is a second step that I did not have to take in my previous job,
right,
which I now have to take.
And do you enjoy it more?
In some ways, it's more satisfying. Financially, of course, it doesn't pay quite as well.
Right, of course.
Government salaries are nowhere near
private sectors.
Investment banking salaries in particular, even in the private sector world. But yes, there is a certain satisfaction from being able to influence an economy that contains 1.4 billion people, now emerging as, soon to be the world's third largest economy,
right,
and specifically at a major turning point in our history. So to have been sort of in the cockpit when a major turning point of Indian history is happening is a privilege. There's no doubt about that.
I'll tell you, sir, right before I was leaving America, which was like a few months ago, I was catching up with all the friends I'd made over a 6-year stay there, right? And these friends were South American, North American, European, African, so on and so forth. There were Turkish guys, there were Argentinian folks from, let's say, Pakistan, Sri Lanka, Nepal, and even elsewhere, even Europe, right? And every time I'd had a conversation, it was so baffling to me that when they would report about their home countries, none of them were as euphoric as I was just default. Like, my default state about India was, yes, we are doing incredibly well. The Turkish were complaining about a slowdown like never before. The Argentinians were doing the same. The last conversation I had with somebody who's an Israeli Jew was like, look, bro, the three global powers of the world right now are America, China, and India. And this is a sort of discourse point I'd never come across while I was growing up. initially I thought maybe we are being a little delusional about it. Maybe that's not the case. But then you see the economy hit a 4 trillion mark. Like you said, we are on course to beat Germany and Japan soon in a very short window of time to sort of surpass their their GDPs. How does one go about understanding this, sir? Because एक तो numeric figure है ना, $4 trillion. What about things like income distribution? Are there any fragilities built into the economics? How does a common person, how does a layman understand where we are economically?
So let me first say that there is no doubt that our place in the world is changing very, very rapidly. So yes, we are already in US dollar terms, the world's fifth largest economy. But in purchasing power terms, if you adjust for purchasing power, we are already the world's third largest economy. And we are growing also the world's fastest. So in about 18 months or so, we will go past Germany. In maybe 3 years' time, we will be going past Japan as well, to in sheer bulk terms, the world's third largest economy.
Right.
Okay. So we will be about somewhere in the $5 trillion mark. Now, that doesn't mean that poverty has disappeared from India.
No.
We will be the world's third largest economy, but the largest population. So once you divide it by the population, we are still a poor country. Our per capita income will still be low, but not as low as it used to be, first of all.
Right.
Okay, so it's rising, number one. Number two, there are some advantages to sheer scale. Okay, first of all, it means that the way we interact with the rest of the world changes, because we can now push our way around in ways that we simply could not have done in the past.
Right.
Right? We can get involved in writing the world's rules. Earlier, we were just takers of somebody else's rules. The way we negotiate trade deals, for example, changes as a result of this. But also, sheer economic strength allows for economies of scale in terms of the industries we create. It means the kinds of tax revenue we generate. Even if we are redistributing to the poor or building infrastructure, we can imagine it in scales we just could not have done till very, very recently in the past. So all of this dynamics begins to change and begins to flip over. So take, for example, China. Okay, as recently as the early 1990s, their per capita income and their economy was basically in the same ballpark as ours. Then they went through this big growth spurt, and suddenly many things began to flip in their favor. It's a different matter that they are currently having some economic problems, but there's no doubt that they're in a totally different place from where they were in 1990.
Agreed.
Right? So our game is to do the exact same thing over the next 20-25 years.
Right.
Now, we are beginning to do it. Let's not get euphoric. This is the beginning of the game. But we are finally beginning to generate the kinds of dynamics we can say could be a sustainable level shift in our economic performance, and then feeding through to other things in terms of economic power, welfare of the people, quality of life, all the other things that you want to have as, a global power that you want to have. But finally, we are reaching the tipping point where these things will become affordable for an increasing number of people, and it will expand over time.
Right.
And the game, by the way, is of compounding.
Right.
So if anybody who in the audience who knows about compound interest rates, and if you learned that in arithmetic class in class 7 or 8 or wherever when we learn it, you will learn that initially you know that things are moving, but it's only after a while that compounding effect really begins to gallop.
Right.
So we are reaching a point by maybe the end of this decade, it will really begin to gallop. That same growth rate will be generating enormous amounts of actual dollars.
Right. Sir, I don't know why you say it's not, we're not ready enough to be euphoric, because this makes me so euphoric. If this is the beginning, where are we really going? Right?
No, that's the point. That's precisely why I'm trying to calm people down. Look, we've got to sustain this for 25 years.
Right. So, sir, one fair way to look at this would be that abhi the growth curve, the exponential sort of increase in this compound interest way is only beginning to happen.
Yes.
Right? And I want to ask you, sir, because when we talk about this, there is necessarily a mention of pehle aisa nahi tha, and now we are seeing more and more of this. Now, I can think of one big change in the Indian economic scene that happens in 1991.
Yes.
Which is we go from being a more closed off, more like non-privatized economy to a more liberal, globalized, the LPG, whatever. Is that the reason? Is that the compounding we are now realizing in 2023-24? Or Is there a different change that I haven't noticed necessarily that has occurred over the last 10, 15, 20 years?
Both.
Both.
So one big shift that happens in 1991 is undoubted.
Right.
I mean, before that, we were a closed license permit Raj, socialist economy. We just didn't aspire for anything bigger. And then 1991 happens. By the way, it's important to remember that it is forced on us. I mean, 1991, I was around in college at that time.
Right.
It's not like the Indian economists of that time were all visionaries and they were demanding. All that happened is our economy collapsed. Our closest ally, the Soviet Union, collapsed. We had no choice but to reform.
Right.
So we reformed. But it turned out to be a good thing.
Right.
As a result of which, finally, some new dynamic began to emerge. All this IT sector, etc., that we're talking about began to emerge, and so on and so forth. And then we began to see a more liberal, market-oriented, more efficient economy, and we began to generate this growth dynamic. However, this has been stops and starts. So there have been some reforms in the beginning, the original Manmohan Singh, Narasimha Rao reforms. Then once the economy got going, because we hadn't it wasn't something that we were really bought into. We did some because we had to. We got some growth and then we all stopped again.
Right.
Then after a little while, it again began to peter out. There was the Asian crisis in 1997, 98, that period.
Right.
Then during the Vajpayee era, again there is a little bit of reform. There is some effort to clean up the economy, get some infrastructure. So the first attempt at creating modern infrastructure happens in the Vajpayee era.
2001, 2.
That total was 2000, 2001, 2002.
Right.
Now that generates some growth dynamic. Again, that generates a period of growth. But then even that begins to peter out by about 2006-07. And then of course there's a world financial crisis. At this juncture, we don't do new reforms. What we do is we try to use the banking sector to expand credit and keep the growth going. So during this period, starting from 2007, 8, 9, 10, there is massive expansion in bank credit without reforms being done along with it. So what is happening is just pumping up the system.
Right.
So many of these things, these loans that were given out, by certainly from 2013, 14, 15, they all go sour.
There's no securities underneath.
Yeah, so all this infrastructure or even corporate capacities we create, they begin to go bad. So the banks begin to break down. So now what happens is that no reforms have been done. So the point I'm making is we do reforms, we get a phase of growth, and then it kind of breaks down after a while. And after a while, we are forced to do another round of reforms. So this is what then again starts after 2014. So another round of reforms happens. Now this round of reforms happens under this Prime Minister. And there are a whole bunch of them. So one big reform is anchoring our macroeconomics and inflation. So remember, we used to always be a high inflation country.
Right.
So 8 to 12% inflation. We were never an Argentina type in high inflation country, but we were a high inflation country in the 8 to 12% inflation. We create a monetary policy committee, create inflation targeting, we bring it down to the 2 to 6% range. So that is one big reform.
Massive.
Then we create a GST system.
Right.
Because before GST, every state has its own tax system.
Right.
Causes all kinds of confusion. So now what happens, you create a GST system for the whole country. So I always say this is a free trade agreement India signed with itself.
Right.
Right. So now goods can go across without hindrance.
Right.
Then you have something called insolvency and bankruptcy code. Why is this important? Because if you want creative destruction, you want innovation, some of it will go wrong. You want a system by which all the innovations that went wrong, all the risk taking that went wrong is continuously cleared up in the banking system so that you can clean it up and do another round of risk taking.
Right.
So the insolvency and bankruptcy code happened. Now all of these reforms began to happen. Then finally, major, next layer of large infrastructure began to get built. So all of this started in the last decade or so. Then, of course, we got hit by COVID. That, of course, 2 years of chaos, as you all know. But even there, I would say we did a good job in terms of managing the economic situation, rolling out our own vaccination program and all that. That was, although those 2 years in some ways was loss, but nevertheless, the one good thing happened as a result is that our own confidence in ourselves as a country did get boosted. Right. And so when we came out of this period, we came out with an economy that had already gone through some reforms before, managed the COVID period much better than anyone else without blowing up our monetary and fiscal resources. And we were still in 2022 still standing, whereas most other economies were really wobbling.
Right.
And then since 22 and now in the end of 23, we are clearly, our economy has recovered very dramatically. And as you know, it is by some margin the fastest growing economy of any size in the world. And all this compounding process we were talking about earlier
Right.
is beginning to happen.
Right. There was something you'd mentioned right before we'd started recording about there being an active effort from the state to withdraw, right? And that being sort of one of the ways in which economic reforms have occurred over the last 10 years. Ki ab mere ko yaar, like I don't want to run public sector. I want to sell Air India off. I want to focus on a limited. And this is very resonant of not entirely, but somewhat resonant of the libertarian. Even Kautilya mentions this limited state sort of argument for how states should interact with people. That the state should focus on judiciary, it should focus on contracts and a few other things. And then the innovation, the business building, that kind of stuff should be left to private individuals and corporations. Tell me a little more about that, sir. How is that sort of, because it's so counterintuitive, na? Like for a traditional Indian way of thought, where government job degi.
हाँ, माई बाप
सरकार, right? Like कि ये मेरे को बचाएंगे. The government is supposed to government and not even government, right? Like that's sort of the way we've thought about it. How is receding and withdrawing from the public space been helpful in reconstructing our economic zones or like thinking about economics?
So yes, I've said this before as well. I am a Kautilyan. I believe in a strong but limited state. So it's important. I'm not a libertarian.
Right.
I do believe in a strong state. But I don't want an all-pervasive state. And I certainly don't want a Nehruvian, weak, all-pervasive state. So what happened after 1991 is that the government slowly withdrew from those things it should not be doing. Right? So that is basically much of the progress you have seen thus far is by the government withdrawing from things it should not do.
Like for instance?
For example, running airlines is one good example, or even getting into business like license permit Raj and all these kind of things.
Right.
That doesn't mean that the government doesn't have a role. I still believe the government has a role. But what should the government do? So the real game now is to gear in. One is the withdrawal of government from things it shouldn't do. But now the game is about getting the government to do the things it should do. So what are those things? One is obviously infrastructure. And that is something we are really now doing in a massive scale. I mean, if you happen to live in cities like Mumbai, for example, you can see the sheer scale of construction that's happening. In fact, not many people realize the largest concentration of cranes in the world right now are Mumbai.
What are they building? Roads?
Well, they're building all kinds of things. Of course, they're building the coastal road, as you know.
Right.
I think it's a 22-kilometer length thing, and that's a lot of it is done already. So it's not some theory thing. You can go to a tall building and you can see it.
Right.
But, even the railway lines, since the 19th century, Mumbai has basically functioned on 2 train lines. Now what we are doing is it has created a third one and a completely modern one. Unlike the 19th century construction, this is going to be an underground railway network with one of the arterial line going from Cuff Parade all the way to Seeps. And then there are these cross lines as well. Now this is basically done. Now all the bells and whistles are being put together. I think by this time next year, you may be able to get to at least large parts of it may be actually functional. And that will change this city. I mean, on day one, this arterial line, I think it's line number 3, will be the world's most heavily used metro line.
Is that not true for Bombay already? The world's most heavily used railway lines locally?
Yeah, but this will be a completely modern thing. This is not, this will be at the cutting edge of cutting edge. Right. And the thing that most of the hard work is done. So it's not that we're going to do it, we are going to build it. It's all done. They are now actually fixing the glass and painting the walls.
Polishing.
They are doing the polishing. Very soon they will be actually doing the train lines running and things like that. So we are getting to the stage where it will get done. Now, similarly, a link to the mainland, new link to the mainland, already built. It should be opened in a few weeks. New airport, Navi Mumbai Airport is getting constructed. And this is just a bunch of things. I mean, this is just the public sector investment. There's the private sector is also investing in brand new tall buildings. You see, there are really cool looking buildings coming up. There's lots of stuff
Very
going
exciting
on.
stuff.
Exciting stuff. I mean, BKC already is cool. There's more cool stuff coming.
Right.
And of course, the old mill land area that is getting repurposed in interesting ways. There are now nice restaurants and bars and nightlife that has popped up in the middle of the milllands,
Which
in
is
Lower Parel.
Yes.
And so you're getting a serious city coming up.
Right.
It used to be if you went to our financial capital, it felt like, acha, theek hai, it's nice enough, but really it's mostly about the poverty of Dharavi. That's the mental image, and trains with people hanging out. Still, that is still there to some extent.
Right.
But there is this other Mumbai that is emerging.
Right. But that's Mumbai, sir, right? And most of India does not interact with Mumbai in any reasonable way, right? There's a small subset. I'm more interested.
Yeah, but there is other cities. I gave that Mumbai as an example.
Right.
But things are happening in Hyderabad. You go and look at the modern cyber city type stuff in Hyderabad. There's cool stuff happening in Bangalore, in Chennai, even in second, third tier cities. I mean, there are cool stuff happening in Pune.
Right.
And there is Ahmedabad, and of course Delhi NCR is booming. We actually have a very high speed link through to Meerut of all places. I don't know. You are from Faridabad.
Right.
And Faridabad
is the best city in the world, sir. Let me just put that on record.
Well, I know we'll have that debate. But the point of the matter is, I can see that Faridabad of the future may be completely different because, the dynamics will simply blow it on to another level.
Sir, I live for that day. I return to Faridabad and it's like a cosmic...
No. So I know Faridabad, as it stands, I agree. But, look at significant parts of Gurgaon.
Yes.
Some parts of Gurgaon now look world class. Not all of it. Right. There are lots of problems all over. But there is at least a fairly large belt that is actually world class.
I spot on, sir. In fact, sir, like infrastructure as a whole, I think is a very high leverage switch for economic policy. Because like before we begin to speak about education, right, which I think has become a bogey word that we just throw in whenever we don't necessarily understand the root of the problem. Infrastructure is more the thing that solves through trickle-down economics, through other means, through providing employment, through finding other people who can build businesses around these. Like, I think that is the real meat of maybe nation building in a certain way. How has Middle India, which is, say, not metropolitan India, experienced... Because I know the road networks has gotten extensively large,
Absolutely.
right? Like, is it true for ports and airports? Is that true for, like, trade routes?
Absolutely. Look at the number of airports there all over the country. I mean, I keep pointing out some of the coolest airports are actually the second tier, third tier airports. Go to Agartala. Agartala has got a fancy airport. Okay. Gangtok has a cool airport.
Right.
Okay. Although it has a problem in that it's in a difficult place to land because of the mountainous nature and the winds and all that. But nevertheless, it does have an airport. And there are new airports coming up in places you wouldn't imagine, smaller third, fourth tier cities, and that is really changing the dynamics of India. I mean, you fly in directly to places like Ayodhya or something like that, and investments are also happening. Cool things are happening in these places.
Right.
I mean, Varanasi was has become a cool place even for Gen Z to visit.
Sir, that is a cultural renaissance happening on the level of narrative, which I want to get to in just a second because I want to stick to what we were speaking about in terms of, say, limited state and where should the state focus itself if not in the areas where it's withdrawing from. One of the ways in which I found, sir, the state has, let's say, almost this unattended overreach. Like, it's not like it wants to overreach in this way. It's unattended. For a brief while, sir, I had the opportunity to proxy as a trainee in the civil services camp of the world. Okay. I knew somebody who was running a training center for them and they would just send me to different places to go and survey and talk to people. So I remember being in the Tehsil in Panchkula, right? Panchkula or Zirakpur, one of these. And I spoke to this gentleman who was probably fairly mid-tier, if not the top or the bottom in the feeding chain. And I tried to understand, why do you think is this such a complicated mess? The office is outside you, full of people whose problems don't seem resolved. They look like they're suffering for years trying to get whatever they're trying to get past. Yeah, there were a few things that came to me. One of them was that एक तो bureaucratic red taping जो है ना, that is huge. And the reason why he said that is because there is a very low trust ecosystem. Like at this point, the country runs on OTPs. which signals that as far as financials are concerned, even couriers are concerned, we are a low trust sort of polity. Not just that, sir, this is represented very directly in law, say with the Income Tax Act. We were just speaking about it a little while before. 2013 is when the Direct Tax Code was supposed to come, where we were supposed to compress all these overarching, repetitive, notional principles of taxation and make India a safer place to invest in by simplifying, say, taxes. Similarly, what this is true for the contract law situation or the real estate law situation. There seems to be a latent overreach, and if not overreach, there seems to be a latent inattention to these parts. And I think this is a very high leverage area that if we were able to flip the switch on this, no, suddenly.
So this actually goes to something I'm quite passionate about, which is that the Indian state needs to do a bunch of things, and the next 20 years of reforms has to be about getting the Indian state to do the things it should do. So one, of course, we discussed infrastructure. Which I agree, needs to be done. And of course, we have now proved that we are capable of doing it. We need to do a lot more, but we have shown that we can do.
Right.
The place where I think we really need to get our job going is in the service orientation of the delivery of justice, enforcement of contract, there's a judicial system, and the service delivery capacities of our administrative system, the general administrative system, the guys who provide you municipal service, or real estate registration office. Those are the interactions that the common citizen has with the state.
Right.
And that interaction, I'm afraid, is still quite unpleasant.
Right.
Right? Why does this happen? This happens because the progress we have made so far is not by improving the state's capacities. It has been basically by withdrawing it from things where it was interfering earlier. It is still the same state.
Right.
And the state is designed for the following purpose. So the Indian bureaucracy was originally set up for the colonial period. The main purpose of the state was to control the population. It was not to provide services. It was just to control the population.
That's because
sorry. Yeah, so that's basically what a colonial power does, right? Now we have independence. Now you'd think that it would change. It doesn't. Why? Because we flip from a colonial system to a socialist system, which is also about controlling the population. You not only control the population, you also control the economy, give licenses. So it's also about control. It's not about facilitation.
Right.
It's not about providing. So one kind of control system simply evolves into another kind of control system.
The socialist system infantilizes its population, thinks it needs the government.
Yes, so it's the same thing. Now, instead of white man telling you that this, you should do this, it is now wise people sitting in planning commission telling you to do this. But it's fundamentally the same idea.
Same idea.
Now, last 20 years, we have told them, no, you shouldn't be telling us, please move. But that machinery has not been upgraded.
Yes.
So you cannot blame the individual bureaucrat cannot blame for anything.
Right.
The problem is the system itself is not set up to provide you services. I'll give you one example.
Yes, sir.
Okay. Where is it that the administrative should be paying it attention? Okay, it's who's the guy whom the average person depends on. So it's the district magistrate.
Right.
He's still the MIBAP of the district.
Right.
The municipal commissioner. These are important people for our daily lives. But it will surprise many people to realize that they are actually the junior most people in the hierarchy of the bureaucracy. So the average district magistrate is only around 33 years old or 35 years old. They are in the bureaucracy, they are actually at the bottom of the heap or little above the bottom of the heap. And they'll be sent to the district. He'll somehow survive there for 18 months and then he'll carry on. Now, this is where the rubber is hitting the road.
Right.
And here you are sending the junior most guy, keeping him there for barely 18 months before he can figure out how the machine even works. How do you expect him to provide services? Whereas when he becomes more senior, when people will finally begin listening to him, he is then sitting in the secretariat pushing files around. So, if you wanted a service-oriented system, you should get much more senior people to be actually being a district magistrate, or to be in the things that actually cut the edge. A senior official should be sitting in the property registration office and make sure it works. Make sure the Tehsildar, Patwari, whoever it is works. So you have to empower this system in a way at the point where the delivery of that service happens.
Right.
Whereas the experienced, more senior people are sitting far away in the state capital, national capital, and so on. Now, I'm not saying that important positions are not there as well. Yeah, I mean, obviously the finance secretary, defense secretary are important people. But a very large part of the service should be here.
It's a high impact position.
This is a high impact position. That's where they should be. And they should be there for long periods of time, not 18 months. I mean, the average district magistrate is just there for 18 months in that position. Should be there for fixed 3 years at least, if not 4 years. And that should be the time period when that person really understands the system, delivers some goods. If you're there for doing something for 4 years, you begin to do it.
Right.
If you're there for 18 months, 1 year, even the brightest guy requires 1 year, at least 1 year cycle to figure out what is even happening. Okay, then 6 months he's able to do something, and before whatever he's doing, he's able to deliver, he's shifted. So obviously, short-term things happen.
I don't understand why even colonial or socialist mindset would dictate. Like 18 months from your logic sounds like an absurdly small amount of time.
No, because in that time, you are actually not interested in doing any big ticket development work. You are interested in making sure that you send a young guy who is risk taking. He and the police chap can control the district during a riot. That is your main thing. So he's more like an operational guy who will take risks, manage the riot when he has to. That is his role.
Achha.
He's not managing a highway project over a long period of time, or trying to improve the schools over a period of time, or whatever else we would now expect him to do.
Right.
That's not his job. He has to make sure riots nahi hote. And then he should be a young, energetic guy. And also, in those days, it was difficult to live in some far-off district. Not today. I mean, most remote parts of the country, cell phones work.
Yep.
Some sort of school is there. Their kids can go. In fact, I am a big believer that until the bureaucracy sends their own kids to the government schools will never improve.
Yes. There is skin in the game in that.
There's skin in the game. You have to create skin in the game. He actually lives there. He actually interacts there for long periods of time.
Right.
So, in fact, even through the system, they may go back to the secretariat. They should come back to the ground again.
Right. You said something about revamping the system both in administrative and judicial sort of terms. And I'll come to judiciary in just a second. But even in first of all, sir, what do you mean the system? Because the system is again a bogeyman as far as laymen are concerned. We just blame the system as if the system is a thing. Do you mean laws, bylaws, rules, regulations? Do you mean system as in the operational architecture of that?
Both of them. So there's two sets. And so here, let me say, there are structural reforms that you need to do. Those are the GST, insolvency and bankruptcy code, whatever. These are big structural reforms. But a lot of the reforms we need to do are actually process reforms. So given a structure, simply the process by which it happens. Why on earth do we need to go through 15 different signatures to get something done?
Agreed.
There's no need.
Right.
So a lot of the reforms we need to do is simply getting rid of all these things. And by the way, again, this comes from the mindset of control. Why do you need those 15 signatures? Because effectively you have, it's all about making sure that you can control something that happens.
Right.
And nobody in the system can be blamed for whatever happened.
Right.
That is basically the logic. You're not trying to achieve anything.
You're trying to prevent it.
Or you're trying to prevent something, or
Right.
at least prevent blame, if nothing else.
Right.
So, given that is the focus, you will obviously have a system of these kinds of processes. Everything requires something called an NOC. In fact, till very, very recently, you wanted a passport also, you had to go to a so-called gazetted officer to get a no objection certificate or some such thing. I mean, why? As a citizen of the country, I have a right to a passport.
Yes.
Right? Unless I have done something criminal,
Right.
you're supposed to give it to me. Why do some gazetted officer, who is the gazetted officer, why does he need to certify who I am? And then it obviously creates a whole ecosystem of dalals, agents and middlemen, and then system of giving small favors. So
A favor ecosystem.
A favor ecosystem happens.
Right, yes.
And again, it goes back all the way to the old system of control. So let me give you an example. There, in colonial period, there used to be a permit called a kursi nashin permit, something like that it was called. Basically, it was a permit to allow an Indian the right to sit in front of a European officer. Okay. Now, it is not difficult to get. It was not difficult to get. But you see, it was a random new favor that was created. So supposing I was higher up, I was the, I considered myself to be a Chaudhary Saab.
Right.
I had such a permit and you didn't. Therefore, I'm higher up the hierarchy. Now, what you can see, what it has done is created a small favor.
Right.
Where nothing exists. Out of thin air, I've created a system of control.
I've created a currency out of nowhere. Yes.
Now, if you behave badly, I will take it away and I'll give it to the other guy. Now, he'll be the Chaudhary Saab. You see, so this is what the gazetted officer thing is, the same logic.
Right.
And much of the fascination with UPSC comes from a perpetuation of this thinking.
There is a status inflation.
Yes, status inflation, entirely artificially created out of this system of small favors.
Right.
And this is all about control. What I'm trying to say is this is not about service delivery.
No. This is about some prevention, some version of like
social control of some sort.
Yes.
Yeah, it's hierarchy and social control. Now, this same problem exists in the judiciary, which is there for exactly the same reason. So you create a judiciary and, even today you go and say, my lord. Why? It's a medieval
Practice.
European practice.
Yes.
Why are we doing this? We even have bizarre system. The entire court shuts down for summer vacations, winter vacations. You've got to be kidding me. I mean, these are colonial or even medieval practices, pre-colonial practices in some cases, which have remained in our system. We need a modern courts which are functioning. Yes, the judges need to take holidays. They should take holidays like everybody else. You put in an application, take your 2 weeks or year or whatever it is in your system, and you take your holidays. Why does the entire court system have to shut down for weeks on end for summer vacations? Why? So I'm just telling you that this whole mindset is the problem.
There is a mindset problem. I agree.
Yes.
There is an attitudinal hangover from the colonial socialist times that we carry on. And I think you are spot on, at least my generation. We realize very actively that there has to be something that changes about this. In fact, our view of the government's functioning is decided by, let's say, the administrative and the judicial touch points that we have, right? And when we see a clogging up, right? We see Tariq pe Tariq, we see the fact that cases do not get resolved, or I have to stand in line for 25 NOCs and licenses before I can open a restaurant up.
No, not just that. I mean, the language of those is also is strange. When you go to the court, it's a prayer. You got to be kidding me, a prayer.
So this is the language of my house. My dad's a lawyer, so when I hear that, it just automatically
Why
cracks
would
me
you be
up.
praying? I mean, who are these great, demigods
Right.
to who we have to pray? So I'm just telling you, the whole thing is set up wrong.
Right.
There's no point in, blaming a particular bureaucrat or a particular judge.
Right.
Some of those guys actually understand that this is absurd.
Right.
In fact, they may even have tried in their small way to change things. But the architecture is the problem. And hence the problem that I'm saying, the system is an issue. And we have to apply our mind to it.
Right.
After all, we have unwound another system. We had a license permit socialist system.
Yes.
We unwound it.
Right.
So it is possible to do.
Yes.
And it will not happen in one shot.
Right.
Because there is a whole architecture to it. So you'll change one bit of it. The rest, there will be pushback against it. After all, the vested interest in each one of these things.
Yes.
So it will evolve over time. But over 30 years, we did change it.
Right.
It's not fully, but very large proportion. This will also change.
So this is our plan over the next decade.
I think this is the 25-year-old project.
It's a 25-year
This
project.
is a 25-year-old project. My generation has started this. Your generation will hopefully end it.
Hopefully, sir.
But the benefits of this are gigantic. Even doing small bits of it will generate enormous growth because the inefficiencies of it are so large
Right.
that you'll get even 8% growth in some years just by making a little bit better. After all, what happened in the last 25 years, that only we
I understand.
थोड़ा कर चेंज होगा तो वो अपने आप चलने लगेगा.
अगर पाइप क्लीन करेंगे तो पानी भागेगा उसमें से. Right.
उसमें से.
हाँ,
तो पहले झटके में ही पूरा पाइप नहीं होगा.
हाँ, right.
And by the way, since we are competing with the rest of the world, let me say they are also human. They are also doing all kinds of things. Like for example, the European Union is going the other direction. European Union.
They're adding regulation.
They are adding regulation. So I mean I can foresee a situation in 25 years' time where Indian businessmen will be mostly complaining about European bureaucracy,
Regulations, huh.
and Indian bureaucrats will be shocked at what European bureaucrats do.
Right.
Right. So
see.
this balance is changing also, and the change in the world that you're seeing is partly happening because of this.
Right.
So sitting in Brussels, you have a group of bureaucrats who are completely unaccountable to anyone else. They're because their national parliaments don't properly control them, and so they're doing all kinds of things. I mean, Britain, of course, ultimately got disgusted and left, which may have its own problems. But I'm just telling you that other countries also have their own
Churning of the wheel.
and these things go in the other direction. And even in India, it can also go in the other direction. There's nothing God given
Right.
that we will always go in the correct direction. So
Absolutely.
one of the purposes of my coming to platforms like this is to tell another generation that please be very careful about this issue. You have to watch it carefully, and at every point in time there will be it's a slippery slope, but there will be some temptation to go back to the government and say, "Aap isko solve kar do." Because the Mai Baap Sarkar is a very easy default.
Yes.
But be very clear that you will pay a very high price for it. Now, once in a while, the state does have a role to play. But be very clear that it is kept controlled, and that when whatever it is to be achieved is done, at the end, and you withdraw the state out of it. If you keep adding up, you will end up with this more and more government agencies, and be clear, you as a taxpayer pay for all of it. Every post-retirement job, you the taxpayer is paying for.
And the inefficiencies created are
Absolutely.
also levied upon us.
Yes.
They are externalities upon the individual more than the system, right?
No, it's an externality eventually on the whole system.
Right. Right. We had picked upon the cultural point of Varanasi, and you'd mentioned how Varanasi has suddenly become a cool place for Gen Z to go to. I have a few thoughts on that.
Yeah.
My understanding, sir, is that after the fall of the Soviet Union and after the fall of the, let's say, the atheistic communist order that had once come to be, people shifted to a more socialistic sort of stance everywhere in the world. Like, all the communist countries had sort of softened. And we went as far as we could with the idea of the global village. We went as far as we could with the idea of liberalism, as far as we could with the idea of this world is a brother, sister. You remember the song, We Are the World, We Are the People? That was part of sort of, when I look back, it sounds like propaganda almost, right? And then what happened is, all countries suddenly around 2014, 15, 16 and up until now have realized, listen, this whole free border stuff, this whole like complete open your arms to the world stuff is not necessarily how things work. And there has been a slight and sudden turning inwards, right? That only appears in large quantities between generations. So when I was 16, what we were growing up on was still the liberal idea, sort of. Now that I'm 28 soon, 12 years later, what a 16-year-old is growing up on is the absolute opposite of it, which is, let's go and look at my roots. Let me understand what Hinduism is made out of. Parallelly to this, what has sort of happened, and I don't know if you take the credit, but I credit gentlemen like yourself and a few others that I've come to meet in this process, who've taken the internet, which is the dominant form of content consumption in India. The YouTuber class is now the television class of 10 years ago. Right? They have taken up the charge to sort of retake or re-explain, or I don't know what the right word would be. Maybe you'd be able to help me with that. Reconstruct the narrative of India from an endemic, from an inside point of view, right? Where we've taken into account our glory and not just our defeats, where we've taken into account our, let's say we've taken a more wholesome view and we've come at a more neutral sort of position. Now, this cultural narrative that is now popular has won a geopolitical impact, right? It has a geopolitical origin as well. When we face the world out large, why must we take the American standards on India? Why must I accept a report from America about human rights when they've been probably the largest violators of human rights in the history, modern history, right? And two, sir, it has downstream cost the 15, 14-year-old to find a home in India far better than ever before, at least in my generation, right? So I think part of the reason why a 16-year-old likes to go to Varanasi is because he's fascinated by his history like never before. The idea of the future has seemed bleak in a global sense, in the liberal sense of the word. And So I want to talk about this cultural shift. I want to understand. My sentiment's always been that culture without the help of economics does not really go far. It becomes an internal battle, much like what Iran did with itself. It tried to own its culture. There was no economic sort of, and then it became a country fighting its own wars and whatever. What is this cultural shift, sir? How does this represent itself in geopolitics? Why is it important for us to have our own narrative? What is your view on that? Sorry if the question was too long.
No worries. I mean, I understand exactly what you're saying because, in some ways, I also went through that process a couple of decades before you. See, the point is that we started out as an India that was very fearful of the rest of the world. Maybe because we had been colonized or whatever. And so, import substitution, close ourselves to the world, and be very moralistic towards the rest of the world rather than participating with the rest of the world. That was our view. Then we opened it up. It certainly benefited us globalizing. But then we globalized into a world where essentially other people set the rules. And one part of that problem is that there is a global elite, the George Soroses of the world, who said, oh yes, you can participate, but we will set the rules for you and we will tell you what you should think about yourself. Now, that too doesn't work. So as Indians, we want to participate in the world. We are accepting, Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. So yes, the world is a family. We are a part of the world. This is not the old import substitution universe of being fearful of the world. But we want to participate in the world in our own terms. And why shouldn't we? We are 1.4 billion people. One sixth of the world population. We'll be the world's third largest economy in no time at all. We have one of the world's largest diasporas. Our diaspora is both proud and successful in all across the world. There is no reason why we should be defensive about our civilization and our roots.
Right.
So we want to participate in the world, but in our own terms. Therefore, we will be rooted in who we are. We not going to pretend to be somebody else.
Right.
Now, this showing through at multiple levels. Even in the West, say, a Rishi Sunak doesn't hide the fact that he is celebrating practicing Hindu.
Right.
Or you have Vivek in the United States. So this is a very big change.
Right.
2 decades ago, these same people would have changed their name from Vivek to Viv or something like that and tried to fit in.
Right.
We don't do that anymore. They said, yeah, we'll participate, but we will do it in our own terms. And while this is happening with our diaspora, this is also happening here. This is not to suggest that we want to invade the rest of the world and obliterate it or dominate it. No. But we will participate and we will tell our own story. Now, as we begin to do this, also remember that the rest of the world, especially this so-called liberal, self-declared liberal elite. I mean, one can debate whether they're actually liberal. I would argue not. But the fact of the matter is the self-certified liberal elite finds this threatening. Because here is a country and here are a bunch of people who are clearly succeeding, who we don't quite control. And so they will try in various ways, try and manipulate this narrative. And one of the ways, which I have written about extensively, is this use of global indices of various kinds. तो आपको बताएंगे, global hunger index, bottom of the list. Global obesity index, top of the list. अरे भाई, hungry भी हैं और obese भी हैं. Think through which one you want to we are. Then you will say, in fact, there is something called the World Democracy Index. So democracy index mein we are some 98 out in the list. World's largest democracy is 98 in the list. So who is the top guys? The top guys are Kingdom of Norway, Kingdom of Denmark, Kingdom of Sweden. The main finding is effectively that to be a good democracy, you have to be a kingdom. So this is the sheer absurdity of all of this. I mean, there is a global academic freedom index. In 2022, we were far below Afghanistan. Now, at least,
be reasonable.
Be reasonable. Even if you're lying, at least try and hide it. I mean, you cannot be this absurd.
Right.
So my point is, this is something we should expect. If you are going to engage in the world, the rest of the world, who is losing their position in the world, in the system. And by the way, many of these people are being also questioned in their own countries. So there is a new thing called Environment, Social and Governance Norms, ESG norms. You may have heard. It's now getting imposed on everything. Now, there is no globally agreed parameters Okay, some random NGOs came up and created some parameters, and they are going around certifying everybody. Now, if you dig a little bit, you will discover that the same three funders who have created all these NGOs and these parameters: USAID, Soros, and one more. I think it's Omidyar or something. There are 3-4 like this. And essentially what they are doing is a form of neo-colonialism, but they are basically using layer upon layer of institutions or trying to tell you, we will tell you कि तुम अच्छे बच्चे हो कि नहीं हो. हम तुमको सर्टिफिकेट देंगे, तुम सही हमारा काम करोगे तो हमको और एक सर्टिफिकेट देंगे और एक लॉलीपॉप देंगे. And they find it a little awkward because India doesn't play by these rules.
Right.
हाँ हम रशिया से ऑयल इंपोर्ट करेंगे, क्या कर लोगे?
हाँ, right. क्या कर लोगे? That pissed them off so much.
So now the point of the matter is, so this is an environment where we have to keep our eyes open and realize that there is a huge effort to try and manipulate us.
Right.
And there are many people inside India who, for their own political, ideological, or whatever agendas, will participate in this.
Right.
In fact, one of the key ways in which the rest of the world system actually these tiny cabal controls and finds its way into our system is essentially not by having very large numbers. Many of these things are not about very large numbers. They're just small number of think tanks they have abroad. They have their friends in Indian academia, NGOs here. Many of them are Lodi Road. In and around India Habitat Center, India International Center, उसी zone में इर्द-गिर्द में वहीं presentation करते हैं, वहीं ज्ञान देते हैं. And many of them have a finger in the system because they are children of our own elite.
Right.
Bureaucrats, judges, etc. Their own daughters and sons work in these and they get dollarized salaries.
Right.
वही लोग हम लोग को विंटर में छुट्टी पे आते हैं अमेरिका से और इंडिया हैबिटेट सेंटर में हम लोगों को पावर पॉइंट प्रेजेंटेशन में समझाते हैं हाउ टू इम्प्रूव इंडिया. तो दिस इज हाउ वी आर बीइंग मैनिपुलेटेड. सो वी हैव टू क्रिएट एन इंडिजिनस नैरेटिव एज वेल. And we have to be willing to go out there and not only interpret ourselves to them, we are now reaching a point where we should be willing to interpret them as well, i.e. turn the gaze.
Right. That is a power move.
That's a power move.
Right.
And so let me give you a concrete example of this.
Yes, sir.
You'll regularly see some election happen, some political event or something happens in India, economic, political event. Then you will read our top newspapers, Times of India, which by the way is the world's largest English language newspaper. Okay? Right. Times of India, however, in its main edit page, will have an editorial by some random Western academic, maybe some associate professor at some random university, and he will get to write about why elections in Karnataka went somewhere or Madhya Pradesh went somewhere. Now, how does he know? Right. Now, the equivalent of this would be if some, associate professor of one of our universities was writing in New York Times about Illinois में कुछ election हुआ या New York State में कुछ election हुआ.
Right.
He is now no one in New York Times is never going to give space to an Indian based in India, no matter how good he is, space in their edit page on dissecting American politics.
Right.
They just would get laughed out. Right? They just won't.
Right.
But we are happy to do it the other way around.
Right.
In fact, we routinely do it. Why? Because of this problem that we have, we still
have a hangover of
we
sorts.
have a hangover of some sort.
Right.
Now, I'm not saying that occasionally it's okay.
Right.
But we do it routinely. You just look at any, Times of India, Hindustan Times, Economic Times, Hindu, all of these top line Indian magazines. Or you look at the guests in our television channels. Random from Brown University, Columbia University, some random associate professor will come, may even have an Indian name, it doesn't matter. Why should we give space to them?
Right.
After all, will the flip side work? Same thing, for example, when, very senior official from India goes abroad. Right. Now, you go and look at when they talk on some stage somewhere, you see who their equivalent they are talking to. They're not talking to their own equal. They're usually talking to somebody who's many layers below them in the ecosystem of that place.
Right.
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 So, a minister from India will be quite happy to go to the UK and go to Chatham House and be at the same stage as a top level
Secretary.
journalist, but
Right.
a journalist. Would the equivalent happen the other way around? No.
Right. So there is a, you know what I think, sir? I think, what we don't understand is there is a soft power element to this entire thing. I was of a very stern opinion that this global elite cabal, this language was conspiratorial until very recently. And I mean, I think my stint in America has something to do with it, because sometimes the narratives that get peddled in that country, speaking from an Indian perspective, I'm like, what are you even talking about? Like, only today I was looking at this, the presidents of, I think, Harvard and Princeton or one of these universities.
MIT, Harvard, and Penn.
Penn, yes, sitting in front of the congresswoman, unable to admit something so basic, right? And it is at that point I started realizing that there seems to be some coordinated effort to keep the narrative polarized in a certain direction. Up until then, I thought of it as conspiratorial. And so every time the word Soros got mentioned, and I've only briefly heard the word Omidyar, right? I don't know what that means or if it's a person or so on and so forth. But it does seem to be that there is some soft power control on global narrative that has exerted itself for a larger period of time. My conspiratorial bet is that it begins with Al Gore back in, the early 2000s with the climate sort of situation. But even Elon Musk recently saying, I don't want to play with the advertisers who are going to blackmail me behind the scenes.
You just see the sheer absurdity of this ESG system that I mentioned.
Right.
The highest rated ESG companies are all tobacco companies. You got to be kidding me.
So much sustainability.
So much sustainability. You can sustainably grow tobacco all the time. And so this complete absurdity is there.
Right.
So this is happening all the time. And what you're seeing in US universities is, of course, one of the problems is the Western mind, as a result, is closing itself. There's a price they will pay for it, because liberal education is not education for self-certified liberals. Liberal education is opening of mind,
Right.
but they have clearly closed their mind.
Right.
And it's their problem,
Right.
very frankly. And I have a hunch that something similar must have happened in Indian universities in the 12th century, which is why, ragtag armies from the Central Asia were able to walk through India and burn down Nalanda, for example.
Right.
Harvard and MIT will discover this one day.
Right.
But meanwhile, the point of the matter is there is obviously a certain kind of manipulation. And I'll give you one example of it. There is now this whole thing of this Khalistani gentleman called Pannun.
Right. Oh my God.
अच्छा, मेरा कुत्ता कुत्ता, तुम्हारा कुत्ता पन्नू.
हाँ. Right.
हमें सोच के देखो.
हाँ.
कि ये, but the point is he will come and bite you also. After all, if it was okay to go after terrorists in Pakistan because he happened to be linked to bombs or whatever, after all, Osama bin Laden didn't personally fly into those buildings.
No.
He was provided whatever was the background to doing it. Now, if there are similar people providing the background to doing terrorist acts by Khalistanis or others as well in India, why should Indians not have the same attitude towards them? I mean, never mind whether or not India did or didn't participate in the, trying to assess, attempt or whatever it is. That let their courts figure it out. I don't know.
Right.
But the fact of the matter is, that is not even the issue.
Yes. The issue is what he says.
And yes, and it is there, and he's openly saying, and let's take that same conversation and put it in this MIT Penn thing.
So let me explain the MIT conversation for people who have no context. So basically, the Congress of the United States summoned the president of Harvard, MIT, and Penn and asked them, does the call genocide for Jews constitute harassment on the bullying code of conduct that you have in your universities? And none of those three presidents could abjectly say yes or no. They tried to play the legal language of, well, if it translates into action. The congresswoman asks, so do you mean if they actually commit genocide, only then will you constitute as bullying? And all three of them have led us to believe that whatever these universities once stood for is like a snake eating its own tail, right? It's not going to protect its Jewish students. And what you were trying to say is that that might be true for Hindu students, given we have guys like Pannu running about amok on YouTube saying, I will kill Hindus.
And they are protecting him.
And they're
So
protecting
why
him.
does this exact same logic not apply to them? So, for example, do they need Pannu to have actually carried out that actual act of terrorism for him to be somebody that we should should be supporting?
Yes.
Absolutely not. I mean, if that applies for these universities, surely it also applies for Pannu.
Right. And I mean, the First Amendment clearly guarantees wahan pe na, that if you state an act of violence, if you call and incite an act of violence, it is not free speech.
After
That
all,
is a clear line.
Screaming fire in a packed theater is not freedom of speech.
No.
You will be punished for it.
Right.
So therefore, something that clearly and actively can lead to some damage, violence or other kind, and you are consciously doing it, that is not free speech at all. That is not covered by free speech in any country, including in the US.
Right.
So that is the point that the congresswoman woman was making. And if this is true in their own congressional hearings, I'm sure they should surely apply it to Hindus. Why only to the Jews?
And sir, this is what I mean. This is probably why we need a indigenous narrative, because if we did not have one, we would think of Pannu as not a obvious terrorist in the making. If
No,
not
but the more interesting thing in this is not that, you see, there are many people doing this.
right.
Pannu in some ways is a very minor player.
Right.
So the question is, how did he become so big? How does he end up in Time magazine?
What?
How does he turn up? I mean, how has he become actually a person that prime ministers and presidents know about?
Right.
Because obviously he has been built up by a certain ecosystem.
Right.
He doesn't have a large organization.
No.
And he certainly does not have a large organization in India.
Right.
Even in North America, he doesn't have.
Right.
So the fact that he has been built up, the fact that there is a whole machinery willing to protect him, willing to take on geostrategic ally like India, tells you something about the complex nature and the size of resources available to this machinery that is trying to manipulate India and other things that we just discussed.
I have one last question, sir.
Yes.
I think I've probably taken enough of your time. I've taken an hour. I have one last question. This is a very audience favorite question. I would generally not find myself being very proud of asking it, but I will still.
Yeah.
Given that this is probably the first time in a long while that two superpowers are emerging in a very close contact area between China and India, where one can say from looking into the future, and touch wood, God bless, that this is going to happen. India and China are both going to be supremely strong economically, irregardless of small sort of, say for instance, what China is having right now and so on. How will we compete with China? Because China is not an ally as we stand right now. China is, well, they're silent, but they can do whatever they want. They're very strategic in this way. How does India compete with China economically, politically, defense-wise over the next 10, 15, 20 years? How do you think about it, if not the government?
So look, we can't wish China away.
Right.
It is a competitor geopolitically, economically, and so on. But we also collaborated with it in multiple ways. We trade with it. We many of the components of stuff we produce here come from there, and so on. And at some point in time, it may also become an export market of ours, although it isn't today. So, point of the matter is that we can't wish China away. So we have to deal with it some way. But we have to deal with it with our eyes open. It is potentially, and in certain areas it already is, a hostile power as well. It does fund Pakistan, which in turn carries out all kinds of terrorist and other activities in India. It has, in other ways, we have direct border skirmishes with them. Right. So it is not the case that we can look on them as a benign power, but at the same time, we cannot wish it away. So we have to manage that relationship. It has to be done actively with our eyes open, not the way we used to do it, say, in 1962. Right. But we have to actively do this. And along the way, we will have to have allies who have similar problems with them. The Japanese have similar problems with them. The Australians have similar problems with them. The US has similar problems with them. So we have created alliances like the Quad, for example,
Right.
which are not just about China. There's about other things. But yes, China is certainly an important part of that equation. We have, in certain places, kept ourselves out. For example, there was this trade deal called RCEP. And we didn't go into it. We instead kept out. And many people criticized us for that. But we took a call that, look, there's a price we will pay, but we will keep ourselves independent of this, because it's largely a China-driven trade pact. We have, for example, there are many apps which we have
Completely banned.
And
We were right about it.
Absolutely.
We were right about it, yes.
And the Americans are finding out why we did it.
Yeah.
And so, so there are things where we take actions of various kinds where we feel that there may be a case for pushing back or banning or taking some sort of an exceptional approach. But at the same time, the fact remains that China is there. There are many areas where we will have no choice but to collaborate with them, trade with them, invest with them, etc. And frankly, that's the way the world is.
Right.
And is always going to be. It's not some special situation.
No.
That's why life is, and world history and politics and economics are difficult things. I mean, throughout history, great empires and powers have had to deal with this.
Right.
Sometimes it has led to wars and conflict. At other times, they have managed to
self-sustain,
coexist in some way, and so on. So, history is a long thing which happens, will pan out over decades and centuries. So, our game right now is to be able to maximize the things for our own purposes, our population of today and the next few generations, make sure their quality of life improves, our economic power improves. We do this without damaging our environment too much. There will be some sacrifice at the margin, but try and maintain it and try and get back as much possible on the other side of this growth spurt. And maintain our cultural, environmental and other integrity of this country.
Okay, sir. Thank you so much. I have one last request.
Yes.
In the new year, sir,
Yes.
I'm going to try and reach out to your office. I would love to have a conversation about Kautilya.
Okay.
Because I've heard so much about you being a Kautilyan. I've heard you talk about him and his ideas, and I've been fascinated. I think as far as historical figures in India go, especially political, especially in the modern context, it could provide a very interesting, ancient, timeless voice for people to think about how we should think about all, for instance, governance, bureaucracy, economics, and so on. If that is ever okay, sir, there's no pressure at all.
Happy to have you back.
Thank you so much. This has been an absolutely fantastic conversation.
Thank you.
Yes.